Once again, I'm Joe Utiki, the editor of Deadline's Awards Line magazine, and I'm thrilled now to introduce you to our panel. So without further ado, please join me at home in welcoming Gillian Anderson, Josh O'Connor, Emma Corrin, hair and makeup designer Kate Hall, and director Jessica Hobbs. And now, Jessica, I wonder if I can start with you. This is your second season on The Crown. You joined in season 3. You directed 3 of this season's episodes. Tell me, if you could, how it felt to return to the show, and what kind of the overarching brief was from Peter Morgan, obviously the creator of the show, for what season 4 would be.
Well, first, it was a real privilege to come back. I absolutely love the show, and I really love working with Peter. He's one of the great creative collaborators around, so it was kind of a no-brainer to come back. And what we talked a lot about was the kind of the pressure point that would be put on the Queen with Thatcher's arrival and Diana's entrance into the family. And I particularly loved that we were going to have these 3 women at the centre of the series following their arcs that went through, not to diminish Josh's role in it at all, but I felt that was just such a wonderful triangle that he'd evoked that could go across the 10 episodes.
Well, and what's been so remarkable to think about over 4 seasons now of The Crown is how much the Queen has had to adapt to the changing face of politics and so many different prime ministers that have come through her reign. Gillian, I wonder what you made of the Margaret Thatcher that Peter had conceived, and where you began trying to wrap your head around how to create this character.
Well, I kind of began at the beginning in terms of research. I began with her childhood and read as much as I could and watched as much as I could. And as you'd imagine, there's a plethora of material out there. I think probably researched enough to head into full steam ahead a proper biopic about Thatcher, and then the nature of The Crown is that these prime ministers are not the centre of attention at all. In fact, they are seen through the prism of the Crown and through their relationships directly with the Queen, primarily. And so it took me a second, I think, to adjust to the narrow paths through which she was being viewed. And then it became about how best to make the most of what I understood about the whole of her in those solitary paths, so that we got a full spectrum of her and her personality. And certainly the scripts do that anyway. But it's a fantastic cross section, but it's by no means about Margaret Thatcher.
Sure, but she's an extraordinary figure, really, because she's this working class woman who's been through kind of sheer force of will, like, ascended to the highest office in the land, and without wanting to get too much into the politics of it, she's probably not quite a working class champion when she gets there, and yet here she is. She's kind of meeting like the highest level of nobility, and it's a difficult thing for her. I wonder if I could ask you a little bit about that and what you made of it.
She grew up as a monarchist, and so I think she was incredibly enamored, on the one hand, of the institution, and at the same time, I think, in order to do what she felt, was her work for the country, she very much wanted the institution to to stick to their job description and just kind of allow her to get on with saving the country, which is, I think, what she thought she was doing. So yes, no, she wasn't a champion of the working class, and yet I do think she believed that she was, on the one hand, because of her roots, and I do feel that she was, trying very hard to pull everybody up by their bootstraps, and yeah. So it was a complicated relationship, but I think they did pretty well in it for 11 years of that relationship, considering how different they were.
Mm. Well, I'd love to ask you, and I'd love to ask Kate about the process of finding Thatcher in the hair and makeup, putting on the clothes. Like, was it a long process to try and get to a place where you could look in the mirror and see the Prime Minister looking back at you?
No, I mean, I felt the minute I sat in front of all of Kate's paraphernalia, just kind of let her get on with turning me into that woman, and so I just sat back and let her do what she was brilliant at. But there was definitely a point where I was kind of like, oh, there she is. Why are you cringing, Kate?
Because there were quite a lot of points where there she wasn't. It definitely took a little while, but that's the way it goes, isn't it? You have to go through the process.
Well, tell me about that process. Tell me about the process of discovery, Kate.
So for us, I mean, we tend to do it in the same way, kind of across the board for everybody. So we throw everything we've got at someone, do all the tricks that we know. With Gillian, we tried numerous sets of teeth, made her look like Ken Dodd. And, Thatcher has her own teeth journey. If you look at reference for the period in 11 years, we had about 7 different teeth looks. So we did, we consider whether that's a story we need to tell. And then actually, by the time we come to camera test, certainly by the second or third camera test, we felt like we were kind of there. But initially, I think where we were trying to do a kind of as fine a job as possible of replicating Thatcher's, even her facial features, Peter gave me some really useful notes. He said, it feels to me like you're judging her. And remember when we first see her, she's full of promise and, she's in her prime. And actually that was great because we started to strip away some of the makeup and kind of forgot about it and didn't let it get in the way too much. And we really worked on perfecting that hair texture and silhouette that she's known for. And we really felt like with most people, when we get the shape, then the acting does the rest and you don't need to kind of faff about too much with the details in between. So I think the process is largely about trying it all out and then letting loads of stuff go. And like Gillian says, there's often a kind of a moment where she's in the room and you go, okay, now we can relax and enjoy it a bit more, kind of.
Gillian, tell me you have those photographs of the Ken Dodd, Margaret Thatcher on your phone.
Gosh, did we? I'm not sure if we took many photographs of that. I mean, we went from Ken Dodd's to kind of very shallow prosthesis, almost like the things that you wear at night to not grind your teeth, to blue tack. We tried because she has a bit of an overbite, and we were trying to, and so we were trying to get that right, and then
very sophisticated makeup techniques on the camera. Very expensive.
I think I do have some pictures of me with blue tack.
I feel like I've got reams of these kind of incriminating photos.
Excellent. Deadline exclusive there, right there. I love it.
Now, Joan, one thing to say just about it is that I think where they really kind of found that line, and it's something that Kate's particularly brilliant at, is just allowing the actor to come through a little bit too, so that there was still space for what Gillian was bringing as Thatcher, not to be disappeared, and sometimes that, and I think Kate's just got that to a fine art with each of the actors. They're applying what's required for the character, but leaving space for what they're going to bring individually to the role.
Absolutely. Josh, Prince Charles has passed through this season. I mean, it's everything from kind of playful flirtation with Diana at the start through to this, real sense of darkness as the marriage is starting to fracture. And I wonder, for you, how did the experience differ to your first time around with Charles? And maybe you could tell us a little bit about that arc and how fun that was to explore.
I think, season 3 was sort of, I guess, kind of if my task in season 3 was to make people feel sorry for Charles, my task in season 4 was maybe the opposite. But I suppose it wasn't kind of a conscious decision. I think there was just kind of, there was essentially, without season 3, I think I would have had a real uphill struggle. I think that kind of, his journey from a kind of young man who's trying to understand what it means to be in this kind of state of purgatory, essentially, waiting for his mother to die for his life to take meaning. It's like this kind of major conflict in his mind and in his life and his relationship with his mother, and sharing his mother with millions of people. That's kind of crazy thing. And so that was sort of trying to understand that, and then not being allowed to marry the woman he loves. And then at the beginning of season 4, I suppose, the dream is that we was getting to work with Emma, who just kind of like upped the game for me, and was just kind of, we just would play every day and kind of explore what any kind of marriage is really, and the ups and downs of any marriage. And but I think the journey going from a kind of a young boy who's desperate for the sort of the acknowledgement, the attention from his mother, and sort of some sort of affirmation, I suppose, to someone who still, by the end of season 4, still isn't getting it, and isn't getting it from anyone else really. And so I love the kind of frustration of that, the tension, the confusion of love, the fact that love can exist and also be painful and angry and violent and all the things that come along with it. I found that fascinating and loved it.
Well, and I'm curious to know now, having done 2 seasons of this show, played Charles for two years now, whether it's kind of giving you a different impression of the man ultimately. I mean, what are your kind of thoughts on him, having gone through this journey?
Yeah, it's a really funny question because, I have a lot of respect for him as a person. I think his views on the climate, which, back in the 60s and 70s, people were sort of laughing him out the room, and now we all kind of acknowledge that that's sort of, taken as read. And I think, so in that sense, I have a huge admiration for him, actually. And I think he's brought up 2 brilliant boys along with Diana. I think that, they're great examples of their parenthood. But really, the big thing for me is whenever I'm asked that, is I kind of feel this weird disconnect and I'm sure that, I don't know, but I imagine Gillian, I know Tobias and Olivia and various people feel a similar thing of kind of a sort of, I suppose, yes, these are real people, but we're, at some point, hopefully you transcend the real person to find something unique that we don't know about the real person, or that we're creating a version of these people. Otherwise, it's not interesting in some ways. So on the one hand, I've got kind of great admiration for this real person, but there's a real disconnect to me from the real person and the character that I've created with Peter and Emma and everyone, really.
No, absolutely, and I think maybe a question for both you and Emma as well is that, like, I think what's so fascinating about the relationship that we're witnessing here is and I think you touched on it earlier, is just how human it is. And I wonder, when you're playing those scenes together, how much it becomes about the humanity of it, and I mean, at a certain point, presumably you just forget the kind of the royal trappings of it, I'd have thought.
Yeah, I think you absolutely do. And I think that's partly due to Peter's scripts, which do completely separate it for you, because suddenly what you're faced with on the page and what you're faced with in the room with personal acting opposite, with Josh and with your director is, are just characters. And it's a story. And like in any film or series that you're in, or any production of anything, you are faced with you, the character, and those emotions they're feeling in that moment. And really, you do just forget about anything else. Because, I mean, for the most part, it's just not helpful. Because, I mean, I remember there was one scene that Josh and I struggled with a lot with, which was in episode 10, which was Diana and Charles' huge argument scene. And really, I think we struggled so much because I think we were confronted with the reality of what we were doing, and the fact that we hadn't taken these characters to that place, that extent of anger before. A lot was being made explicit through the script, through the scene, that hadn't been before. And it was kind of very uncharted territory for us. And we really had to kind of work on breaking it down bit by bit. And as you say, discovering the humanity behind, the nuance behind everything, with every beat that we were playing in that scene. And I guess kind of make it properly tangible to us to be able to play it.
Josh, tell me a little bit more about.
Also, in the same, I think in the same. About what? Sorry.
Well, go ahead with your thought.
I was going to say that I think Emma, and also like in the same way as the kind of the disconnect between the character and the real person. I think likewise when you're telling a story, essentially a story about kind of a failure of a marriage. It's actually not that I sort of found it wasn't actually that helpful to just kind of take too much information from facts, because we don't know what that marriage was really like, and I have no idea how Charles behaved, and I suppose it's just kind of, I think it's more interesting to see like, well, what is this relationship, and what, Emma and I would constantly kind of talk about what happens if two people who both need the same from each other, who both require that same, and neither of them are equipped to offer that to one another. What happens when that happens in any relationship? Forget Charles and Diana. What does that come to our characters? And I think often people like Gillian and Tobias, who are all kind of like old pros at this, sort of do it in a kind of natural, and it just sort of naturally happens. But there's a kind of, I think, just for Emma and I, just engaging on, just reminding ourselves that like, what's interesting about the
Crown. Because we've been old enough to have so many failed relationships. We're very good at that. But you youngsters, just
we happen to have the same problem.
Well, Jess, can I ask you what the experience was like of shooting those scenes? Because they do play such an extraordinary part in this finale, and everyone will have just watched them as well. What was the experience like of kind of witnessing? Because these two people are being incredibly modest about it. I think what they do in creating this dynamic between these two characters is just extraordinary. It's revelatory work. So tell me about witnessing that on set.
I agree. They're being incredibly modest about it, and as if they just kind of broke it down. It was really simple and blah blah blah. The first thing I remember is that Peter decided to turn up when we were shooting that scene, and we shot it quite early in the block, which was a big ask for them, because at the same time as they were shooting that sequence, they were also shooting things for the opening episode. So that meant that from day to day, they were having to travel, 10, 11 years in their life and their marriage. So we talked about some of that, and actually having Peter there was brilliant, because he did what he always does, which is gets rid of excess in the script, and was, I think, really, my feeling was really gave them his blessing to go as far as they needed to, and as far as actually felt right in the emotional circumstances. And we did talk about that, I remember, Josh, because we'd never seen him really lose control, and I think what we were trying to find was the truth of that moment. And I think, faced with great emotional difficulty, often none of us behave well. There's a beautiful kind of almost look of shame that comes across his face after he's exploded, which I just thought was such an extraordinary part of his performance. And also the fact that we see how incredibly wounded Emma is as Diana, but that she understands that something is fundamentally broken in that moment. And so for me, you've got these two actors performing at such a level of truth and kind of understanding, but they did it in such a way that they allowed themselves to be completely vulnerable. So, I just take my hats off to both of them.
Absolutely. Well, and listen, given that we talked about a difficult moment, I think for Josh and Emma, Gillian, I wonder if I can ask you as well. Like, what was kind of the hardest aspect? What were the scenes that were the toughest to shoot as Thatcher?
probably the audience scenes, because they're so long, and because there were quite a few of them, and in the times that we shot them over 2 or 3 days. We did, I was in 6 episodes. In each episode, I think I had 2 audiences, and there were a couple of days where we did 4 audience scenes back to back. And then, a few months later, we did another 4 audiences back to back, and so that on the one hand, that was the only way to do it, because that, it was a location thing. And on the other hand, that's not just a lot of dialogue, but a lot of a different trajectory also for the character at different stages of. And I think we started shooting with 2, 4, and 5, and then in the new year we went to 1 and 10. So the audience scenes for 1 and 10 were in the same period of time. And anyway, so it's that old delightful thing that actors often have to contend with, which is shooting out a sequence, but also just trying to make them different enough and to feel like they embodied the weight of what had gone before. Both politically and personally, and I was actually really surprised after the series aired that people were enjoying those scenes, because they were so torturous. They were so hard. And when people were saying they were enjoying the audience, I think most of the time I was like, you did? Like, really? But yeah, so probably that was...
Well, there you go. I mean, I think that's just sort of evidence of the reward of the effort put in. But Kate, I think Gillian touched on something interesting there, which is that, the course of those audiences changed over the course of Thatcher's premiership. And what's unique about this show, I think, well, not unique, but certainly very specific to the show, is that each season is dealing with a huge period of time, and in that period of time, things change. I mean, lives change, people's looks change, sometimes in incredibly subtle ways, sometimes in much more dramatic ways. I wonder for you, if you could explain a little bit about the research process behind making sure that in any particular scene, we're seeing the vision of the character that is right for that particular period that we're in.
Yeah, so we have a really extensive research period before we even start sort of prepping with the actors. So I will compile, I've got a huge database now from about 1964 until 1991 so far. And I tend to save photographs endlessly from every character for every year, and then I compile them all in photo books so that we have a kind of constant visual reference for everybody to check in with. And then, realistically, we can't do everything. So, we didn't tell the teeth journey, and we pick the kind of relevant points that we think kind of, emphasize the dramatic performance. So we have Thatcher and Diana with their different journeys. Diana's was difficult because we were taking a very young lady from basically kind of almost adolescence into a kind of really media savvy icon. And then with Thatcher, we had this woman who started at a kind of, really ballsy, impressive status. And then actually what we see in episode 10 is her decline. And we tried to do that quite subtly. But, it depends, because we have this logistics of shooting blocks. And like everyone says, we're shooting episode 10 and episode 1. We can't have actors just changing wigs left, right and centre. So we have to be really strategic to plot how we tell those stories, so that we're not kind of killing the actors with hair and makeup changes all the time, and the scheduling directors, and everyone needs their time. So it's quite a carefully managed process. And then when you have things like Diana had long hair in 1984, and you have these rare moments of, thank God Peter didn't write any Diana in 1984, and he obviously didn't do it with her hair, but thank goodness. So, we have a selection of wigs, and then we kind of strategically plot what we can do with the wigs that we have.
Well, and Jess, I wonder if I could ask you as well how that kind of applies more broadly to the production. I mean, how much of a complicated juggling act is it to make sure that this train stays on tracks as you're going through the process?
It's enormously complex. It gets, for me, it got easier coming back to do a second season. But I always try and describe it to people. It's like you get on the biggest, best cruise ship in the world, but you can't get off it for a year, and you've got to be ready at all times for whenever they call you. And when they do call you, you've got to go to a part of the ship that you've never seen before, and you need to know everything about it. So that's my kind of description of the show.
That's great.
You have this extraordinary research team, and there's about 10 of them. They're both historical research, visual archivists, and then there's political researchers as well. So you can go to them specifically and say, for example, in 10, where was Thatcher at? Where was Howe at? What was happening in the cabinet? Can you give me all of these ministers? I need a breakdown on every single one. The fact that you have access to people who can do that work for you, I'm so grateful for, because it is limiting, the amount you can do as a director. And if you're doing 3 episodes, you're often covering 6 or 7 years in those 3 episodes, and you have to know politically at what point everybody's at. All of the departments are enormously supportive, but I would just really like to pay tribute to that research department. I think to none.
An extraordinary group, and I mean, I think everybody across this production is firing on all cylinders here. I'm sure the audience watching at home would agree with me, and I'm afraid to say that's all the time we have. So it only remains for me to say thank you to our wonderful panel for The Crown, and to hope you'll join us all again for another screening series event very soon. Goodbye.
Bye. Thanks, Jo.
Thank you.
Thanks.